Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeka, and with me today is Kenan Sharpe, a journalist and academic who writes mostly about Turkish culture. Thanks for joining us, Kenan. Hello.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Let's start with Selahattin Demirtaş. The Kurdish politician and former presidential candidate has been busy in prison. Imprisoned in late 2016, he released his first book of short stories the following year, Seher in Turkish, Dawn in English. The book and Demirtaş case gained some international renown after Sex and the City star Sarah Jessica Parker was photographed carrying it in New York City in late 2018. Then last year marked the release of another book of short stories, Devran, followed just, I think, 9 months later by Demirtaş's first novel, Leylan. You wrote in a recent column for Duvar English that the book, which has a number of interconnected narrators, marks a newfound confidence in Demirtaş's writing. Please tell us a bit more about the book.
Absolutely. It's an incredible and quite ambitious book, and it's actually sad that in the epilogue, Demirtas says this might be his last literary work, because it shows a really sort of inventive new voice. I mean, the first two books were, like you mentioned, collections of short stories, and this novel has a bit of an element of that with these interconnected narratives. But it's quite a sprawling story that starts off on the back streets of Diyarbakir in Turkey's southeast, and from there moves to Istanbul, and even from there to Zurich. So it's an ambitious work dealing with characters, Kurds, Turks, even the granddaughter of Irish revolutionaries, all in these sort of interconnected stories that it's only in the last few pages that one really understands how they all fit together.
Wait, the epilogue. So he said he may not write anymore. Did he say why he may not?
He doesn't exactly explain. He says he feels like he's done what he wanted to do with literature, and he sort of expresses his doubts about whether it's really his calling to be a literary writer. But I think these three books that have been written back to back and have, in Turkey and in the world, like you said, had such a exciting response.
Right, especially since it
It was
was such a flurry of activity in what, 3.5 years. He's written three books. Few writers are able to do that, and respectable work.
respectable works, absolutely. There's aspects that are uneven, and there's moments where you feel Demirtas the politician or the orator instead of Demirtas the short story writer or novelist. But overall, these are powerful works of literature, and I do hope personally he keeps writing.
You write that the book makes regular allusions to real life events in Turkey. One of them mentioned in your piece is that Kudret's, one of the main character's former classmates, who becomes an academic, gets fired for signing a peace petition, which is a clear reference, I would assume, to the Academics for Peace, in which hundreds of Turkish academics were dismissed for signing a call for peace in Turkey's southeast. So, more broadly, is the book heavy handed in its pro Kurdish progressive stance?
I would say that overall it's not heavy-handed, which is, I think, what is important for a work like this, to not be able to be written off as simple propaganda, though there are those who try to say that. It really is a novel first, and it attempts to provide stories. And really, I think you could say it's about happiness and what makes a life worth living. And for Demirtas, as for many of us, politics is an important aspect of that. So he doesn't shy away from bringing in current events. There is the academic for peace, absolutely, and it's actually quite explicit that that's what two of the characters in the novel are. There's also discussions of the Kurdish language and what it's like for children in Turkey's southeast who grow up not speaking Turkish to suddenly enter state school and have to try to keep up and understand what's happening. There's moments where the political language gets a little bombastic. You have these long discussions between this husband and wife character, and they get into talking about the sort of ethical implications of different technologies. At one point, they even debate Karl Marx's labor theory of value, and at moments like that, the reader finds themselves a little bit rolling their eyes. Not because politics is discussed, because there are moments where it doesn't quite feel integrated into the narrative itself. But overall, I would say the references to contemporary politics, the broader discussions about ethics, about happiness, about what it is to be political, are really quite powerful.
Right. You write that despite all these kind of mentions of the politics, the most political aspect of the book might be that it aims to open a channel of communications or build a connection. I can only assume that you mean between sort of the standard Turkish and standard Kurdish views. How does it do that or attempt to do that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It does that on that level, absolutely, between Kurds and Turks, between other people who are made into an other in modern Turkey, like in many places. But also, there's a more sort of philosophical dimension about how do people connect, how do people understand one another. Um, as I mentioned in that Duvar article, there's a really interesting sort of turn towards sci-fi in the book, where a man who's gotten into a car accident and is in a vegetative state, his wife takes him to this experimental brain research center in Switzerland, and there they're able to hook up their consciousnesses, and she actually enters into his dreams and tries to intervene and bring him back from the coma.
It's a little bit of Inception almost.
Yeah, yeah, a little bit, or it reminded me a little bit of Black Mirror, that sci-fi Netflix show. So in that sense too, it's not only the political sense of how people connect, but also really in romantic relationships and friendships, how do we understand one another? And I think that's what makes the novel successful as a novel, is that it sees politics on a continuum with all sorts of other questions about what it is to live and be in connection with others.
It makes an interesting metaphor about like trying to get in each other's heads and understand each other.
Absolutely. And in that aspect of the story, I couldn't help but think about what it is for us as readers and then reading these works, accessing them, and then Demirtaş himself writing from prison, and how we can have connection across distance as well. Where I can imagine in a situation like he is in, one is cut off in many ways from the outside world, and you could really just turn back into your memories or things you could imagine happening. So he, in some ways, I think writing books has been his sort of window out to the outside world. Whereas for us, it's sort of a way of accessing what he's thinking and who he is as a person as well as a politician. So I think it's powerful in that aspect.
Thinking of that, I mean, if you say that, it's surprising then that you would argue, I think, that these three books they don't deliver a clear political message. They're more just kind of a sense of humanity, it seems like.
I think so, or the political message is that it has to be based in humanity.
Mhm. Okay, despite this kind of humanity focus, in the real world, perhaps unsurprisingly, the book and his books have been divisive. Istanbul municipality, which after 25 years under the ruling AKP and its predecessors is now run by the main opposition CHP's Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is widely seen as the next challenger to President Erdogan. The city has been selling Demirtaş's books online, which has drawn criticism for pro-government media that is promoting terrorist propaganda. My first question here, do many Turkish cities sell books online? And are those books often written by politically polarizing figures?
Do many Turkish sites sell these books?
Cities.
Cities. Um, I would imagine that all of Turkey's major cities pretty much have bookstores where you can buy, for example, books by figures like Demirtas. And another thing Ekrem İmamoğlu said in his comments about these critiques that Demirtaş's books were sold on the municipality website as well as the Turkish postal service website is that these are legal books. There has not been a court case yet that has successfully banned Demirtaş's novels, for example. They're also held in the state library as other important books that are published. So in that sense, it's really absurd to imagine that they shouldn't be sold. I think, bookstores, of course, private bookstores can make their own choice about what they'd like to sell. And I think I've seen bookstores in Istanbul and Ankara that have these books, Demirtaş's recent books, front and center as you walk in, displayed prominently. And there are other stores where they don't have them, but these are fairly easy books to access, as they should be.
Right. I mean, I just asked because I don't think it's a common practice in the US where I'm from to
Hmm.
for the city to sell books online.
I see. I see. Yeah, it is strange, and for the post office to have its own online shopping site. I
Right.
was also surprised by that.
Okay, okay. And then last month, Imamoglu's wife and Demirtaş's wife together attended a play based on Devran, his second book. Um, Interior Minister Soleiman Soylu denounced their decision to watch the play, saying, "You wash the blood off your hands with theater." This spurred several publishing houses to issue statements in support of Demirtaş's writing. What seems clear is that the books have enabled Demirtas and related Kurdish political issues to stay in the public consciousness despite his being in jail now for more than 3 years. So one could say his literary career is sort of now his political campaign, and it seems to be doing just fine.
Absolutely, these books have kept them in our public consciousness, and I think especially because one can issue statements, as Demirtas does from prison, talking about his positions about various issues in Turkey's political life. But I think releasing literature keeps the issues he cares about and also himself as a figure in our attention in a way that I think, just declamations can't. So I think it's been really powerful, and I think that's part of why there's been a pushback in certain circles about these books. I don't think their goal is propaganda, but one of their effects is that we continue to pay attention to Demirtaş's case, the things he thinks about the HDP as a party, and I think it makes some nervous.
And it gives him a certain level of control and the ability to get to some nuance because he can write at length.
Absolutely, absolutely. It gives us a side of him, and it allows us to see his politics in a kind of more broader, within a larger philosophy of life, you could say.
Another recent piece of yours detailed how Istanbul's music scene has lost something important in recent years as its music venues have mostly gone corporate. You saw a show at the remote and somewhat soulless Zorlu Performing Arts Center, which is attached to a mall in an area that feels very little like kind of old Istanbul or central Istanbul. You write of walking through, quote, the endless depression tunnel that connects one middle of nowhere to another. And you pointed to the lengthy security line and coat check as well as the necessity of a Zorlu drink card for overpriced drinks. You write that the shift to these places like Zorlu, IKSV Salon, and Babylon Bamontiada has happened in just the last 5, 6 years. Why is it happening now?
There's been a few things. I mean, Turkey has a really thriving independent music scene at the moment, but as you just summarized, sadly, many of the places where one can see these really interesting local bands is in these places that are either owned by major holdings or are in some ways expensive, hard to get to, soul-sucking, etc. And I think there's been a few reasons. I mean, Turkey had in the first sort of decade of this century really exciting things happening in terms of the music scene. It was a moment, I'm talking particularly like 2009, 2011, before Gezi and around that time, where a lot of bands who would tour in Europe would also come to Turkey. And a number of factors made it so it's been much harder for these groups to come, and has also caused a lot of venues to shut down and now be sort of bought up by these monopoly-like organizations. So I think some of those factors that have created this situation is um, one of them is the fact of the Turkey losing value against the euro and dollar, where it's harder and harder to bring foreign acts into the country and pay them enough for it to be worth it. Another reason there's sort of been this monopolization in concert venues is that it's harder for small venues to make it. I mean, especially around 2016 with the attempted coup and then the subsequent various terrorist attacks that really struck a blow against Turkey's nightlife. It became harder and harder for these smaller local venues to stay afloat. Um, there's also the issue of alcohol sponsorship. There are a number of great festivals that happen yearly, and there are various laws limiting how alcohol companies can sponsor events, and if you have to be 18 and over to attend and things like that. So I think all these factors have made it so that one can really run a loss if you have a musical venue or you're trying to bring important acts. So the people who can sort of take these hits financially tend to be things like the Yapı Kredi Bank or the Eczacıbaşı Group or various big holdings and corporations like that who can fund these things. And I think they have an important place because they keep this alive. But it really is, it's sad to lose these smaller places that one can walk to on foot and pay less and have a more intimate environment.
Right. Speaking of walking on foot, is it also perhaps related to the decline of Istiklal and Osmali Mesjid and Galata areas in recent years? I remember in 2011, 2012, 13, those areas were bopping at night on the
Mm.
weekends, and now I hear I can't confirm this, but I hear that they're relatively empty these days.
Absolutely. I mean, there are still great things happening in Beyoğlu despite all the changes. But we used to have Babylon was there, of course, in a smaller masjid, and now that's been transferred over to the Bomontiada complex. There are a couple small places still left in Taksim Beyoğlu, but really I was trying to make a list of the venues that are still independent and enjoyable and have good things going on. And I'm thinking of places like Karga in the famous bar street in Kadıköy. There's a newer place called Bina. The old wonderful reggae and rap bar that was in Taksim, also Naya, has also moved to Kadıköy. So there are things happening, but it really has experienced this geographical shift, where the few places that are left are centered over there now. And the ones that are left, especially on the European side, are these larger places like the Volkswagen Arena or Küçük Park or some of the other quite enjoyable sometimes venues I mentioned, but that are owned by big corporations and are also less enjoyable to attend.
So what has this meant for fans of Turkish music and for local bands? Is it harder today for a new Istanbul band to book a gig to get some attention?
I think it is. There are smaller places. I'm thinking of a place like Pender Corner or other bars where smaller bands can play a show. But I think one of the great things for up and coming bands is to play, with the kind of mid-level bands. I'm not talking about pop star status, but some of the bands I've written out about, whether it's Gayesu Akyol or Jacuzzi. I mean, these bands now pretty much only play the sort of venues we've been talking about, and they'll sometimes have opening acts. But I think there's sort of a split where these bands have reached a certain level of popularity now, where they're either playing at these expensive venues or they're actually able to book shows abroad in Europe mostly. So I think it's hurt the independent scene. But in other respects, I mean, these sort of mid-level or higher level bands I'm talking about are really doing quite well and are gaining a lot of fame. But I think the gap maybe between the newer bands and these more established independent bands is growing.
Right. In the piece, you also point out that these new venues have excellent sound systems and have likely boosted relatively successful Turkish music
Mm.
acts, which has, of course, played a role in the emergence of Turkish music globally, which you talk about in another recent column, writing that acts like Gayesu, Akyol, Jacuzzi, She Passed Away, and Ezel could soon replace Turkish TV shows as the country's best known export. Why do you think this is happening now? Is it partly a result of Akyol's wildly successful third album, which won a major honor in the UK and led to a glowing profile in the New York Times?
I think she's part of it, but I think actually she is even riding a previous wave that has made sort of set the way for her to be so popular, to win various music awards, to play sold out shows in London, etc. And this phenomenon that has sort of made all this possible, I think, is the discovery of Anatolian rock, is what we call the psychedelic Turkish rock music of the 1960s and 70s. In the early 2000s, various music labels like Finders Keepers have not uncovered, because people here in Turkey have known about this music, of course, forever, but have introduced this wonderful creative music combining global trends of rock music with local Turkish folk music. They've discovered this stuff, reprinted in glossy sort of LPs, and people have bought this stuff up. It's an incredible. I mean, Turkey's not a country where people have been very interested in its music, but this psychedelic stuff really, I can't tell you how many times. I'm from California. I grew up there. I've been in an event or a party, and I mentioned something about Turkey, and someone's, oh, Selda Bağcan, she's incredible. Speaking of this now 70-year-old Turkish rocker. So this stuff starting to gain popularity abroad about, 10, 20 years ago, has really made people curious about what's happening in Turkish music. And I think someone like Gayesu Akyol, also before her Babazula, have been able to build on this by creating psychedelic music, but also in their own way. They're not just imitating the 1960s and 70s acts. And then from there, people start thinking abroad, whether in Western Europe, in the States, in Canada, what's going on with Turkey? What's happening with this music? So now you have acts like Jacuzzi, like She Passed Away, that are not psychedelic at all. They're playing synth pop, other kind of 80s nostalgia genres, things that are popular in independent and kind of
Yeah, it makes
hipster
me think
music
of
scenes.
Cure and New Order.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Cure, New Order, all that kind of stuff. So I think from psychedelia to Gaisu Akyol and now these acts, there's people are interested. They realize that Turkey is up and coming musically, and I think it's a really exciting moment.
One issue you mentioned in the piece is this problem of labeling. You
Mm.
called it Anatolian rock, some call it Turkish psych, and a Turkish producer you talked to complains that Turkish garage rock is labeled world music rather than simply garage rock. So, how do we deal with this issue of labeling, or is there any way to kind of simplify it?
It's really tricky. I mean, I contend that psychedelic rock is not the correct label for Anatolian rock because that's not how people understood it at the time. There are various names for this music, but it's a anachronism. It's something we've come to later. But I think, we have to be real that there are real marketing strategies or ways to gain recognition and get people interested in. I think using the word psychedelic is legible to people outside of the country. So I don't think we should just abandon it. I think we should recognize its limitations. Um, but it's tricky. I mean, for example, there's a group. It's called Altungün, and half of the members are Dutch and half of the members are Turkish, and they were nominated recently for a Grammy Award for Best World Music. And, they are building on traditions of Turkish folk music. So in that sense, I could see why one might call it world music, though that label itself takes anything not made in North America or Western Europe and lumps it into the same category. But also it's sort of a Trojan horse, you could say, a way to get this stuff recognized and have people understand it. So I think maybe our job is both to or for these musicians, I think they want to both use these techniques to get people interested. And I think also, particularly someone like Gayesu Akyol is very eloquent about the limitations of something of like the category world music. And and her music, of course, people misunderstand. There was that wonderful New York Times profile about her. But the sort of basis of her music is not even Turkish folk music like it was for the rockers in the 60s and 70s. It's really a different genre with a quite different history that we call in Turkish Türk sanat music or Turkish classical music. People like Zeki Müren created this kind of music, or Müzeyyen Sanar. So I think there's a lot of tricky factors involved, but I think overall it's a positive phenomenon. This is happening.
Speaking of another musical phenomenon, the Turkish rapper Ezel, he burst into the public eye. He burst into the public eye in mid 2018 with the song and video for Sherimin Tada, or Taste of My City, a raw evocation of life in Ankara, his hometown and Turkey's capital. As it gained in popularity, Ezel gained the attention of authorities, unsurprisingly perhaps, and was sentenced to prison for lyrics that were said to encourage drug use. He was acquitted and released a few weeks later. And I just took a look this morning. The video for Sherry Mintada has now been viewed nearly 75 million times. Please tell us, if you could, a bit about the emergence of Ezel and the popularity of this video and this song.
So it's been quite interesting to watch Azhal's rise. He, got his start actually under a different name, Ay Sezav, in the earlier 2000s, and he would play shows on the street. He would attend rap battles and things like that. And then with the album Mubtazal, I think it was 2016, he really started to blow up. I mean, he had a sort of solid fan base amongst hardcore rap fans. But with that album and with The Taste of My City, that single and music video in particular, it really blew up. And I think he was saying something really interesting. Of course, Ankara, despite being the capital, has this sort of second city complex. And, in rap, as in most genres and in Turkey's cultural life, Ankara sometimes comes second. So I think having someone from this city really talk about, what it's like to grow up in Ankara and the sort of less savory aspects of it, from the slum neighborhoods to everything else. And there were references to the Gezi Park protests of 2013 in the video. I think the realness of it really spoke to people. It was really something different.
Right. One music critic said he spoke for the lost generation of Gezi. Was that the feeling that you got? Do you think he was actively trying to be a political voice, or he's just kind of expressing his view of Turkey and his hometown?
I think it's both. I think for him, expressing the truth of Turkey in his hometown is also talking about politics. But I think what people like Ashal do is quite interesting because, there's a long tradition, of course, of politicized music. There's the band Group Yorum has been in the news again, while some of its members are on a hunger strike related to current charges against them. And I think Ashal is something slightly different, where this is in some ways this album is party music. It's supposed to be enjoyable. It's supposed to be something you could sort of bang your head to, listen, sort of nod along and have fun. But at the same time, he doesn't shy away from bringing political things in. And there are very clear references to Gezi, to the government in that album, but within this larger package of just talking about what it's like being a young person in Turkey today. So I think in that sense, it's quite powerful because it's almost like with what I was saying about Demirtas. It's not politics for the sake of politics, but it's seeing it within a larger frame. And I think I think this music really speaks to this generation and to young people in Turkey today because it sees politics within this larger continuum.
Speaking to young people, last September, Ezel released a video for his new single "Olay" around the same time as another rapper, Shanasher, released Suzamam. The two videos took Turkey by storm and were seen by something like 30 million people in 1 week. Were these two releases planned to coincide, and why did they make such a splash?
Um, there's been a lot of speculation about how it happened that these two, in some ways quite similar music videos, dropped at the exact same moment. I was able to actually speak with Shanashar a few months ago, and he says that it was purely accidental. There was no collaboration between
That's incredible. That's
Azhar.
hard to believe because I think they were released in like the same hour, right?
They were both released at midnight on September 16th, September 6th. So it's really astonishing. Um, but yeah, they both contend that it was a pure accident that it happened. But I think it shows something about the sort of feeling in the air, both that rap is gaining in popularity, but also feeling, people making the music in this genre feel more confident about it, commenting on politics and everyday life. Um, and I think the response these videos enjoyed really shows both, yeah, how powerful rap can be as a sort of medium of social commentary, but also it was interesting to watch all the people who don't normally follow rap or have been inclined to write it off as not a very serious genre in Turkey were suddenly talking about this video. So it went far beyond the subculture of people who listen to this music. And I think a lot of people, who have been watching Turkish politics over the last decade or longer with concern really felt some of their concerns and thoughts expressed through these videos. And I think that's why they made such an incredible splash.
Both songs were rather outspoken about the failures of Turkey today, in particular the foibles or the let's say law breaking of the current government, the AKP government. Are popular Turkish songs often so outspoken about these things? And when they are, don't the artists get into trouble? This time they did not, as far as I know. There were no charges.
Yeah, there were no charges in this case. There were instances of pro-government figures or Sabah newspaper, for example, writing comments trying to claim that this video, especially Susamam, was, quote, a PKK FETÖ operation.
Hmm.
Um, so there was pushback. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I mean, other bands who come out of, explicitly leftist traditions, Turkey, from the 60s to today, from Cem Karaca then to, like I mentioned, Group Yorum today, have, faced criminal cases for this. But in this case, we haven't seen that. I think, I don't know if it's the popularity of these things, the fact that, things that are produced within the sort of left-wing culture of Turkey, which still has, quite a strong communist movement, um, don't reach out to the wide swathes of people the way I think rap music can, for example, that's still very much part of youth culture. So I don't know if it's the popularity of this that has made it more difficult to touch, or the fact that the politics is within this larger frame. But yeah, so far they've been able to make these quite political statements and get away with it. Though of course there's been other problems with this out.
Other problems?
Oh, in the sense that he was, um, brought to trial for quote
Ah,
promoting drug use in his
yes,
music.
yes. I mean, yeah, and it's all the more interesting in light. These videos came out soon after the electoral defeats of the AKP in local elections. It's surprising that they didn't try to kind of stifle this anti-government momentum, let's say.
Yeah, yeah, it's true, absolutely. But I think there's a sort of feeling of, as slight as it might be, a kind of opening from those local elections, and these music videos are definitely much a part of that, even if they don't refer to it explicitly.
And now Ezel, I hear, is spending most of his time in Berlin. Has he moved there? Is this a self-imposed exile? Is he trying to stay away from Turkey due to persecution, or is this just a professional move?
It's a bit of all of those things you could say. I mean, I think he feels, I would imagine, pushed out. I mean, the court case against him for um, promoting drug use with his lyrics and other, as I understand, pending court cases have made him feel unsafe in Turkey. So that's an element sort of pushing him away from here. And it's sad, especially because, Müptezel, his album in 2016, was such a place-based album, really very much about Ankara at that period and what it's like to be from Turkey. And I think moving away has opened up career possibilities, and that's one reason he's there. He's collaborated with a bunch of European rappers. Of course, Berlin is the birthplace of Turkish language rap, um, and he's been able to collaborate with different people and also play a lot of um, sold out successful shows. So there's career benefits to it, but I think um, with a feeling of not being able to be fully safe in Turkey, it sort of made it where Berlin feels like the safest place to be. He only returns every now and then for concerts and then goes back. So it really has become his home, and I think it's a real loss for Turkey. We have this really interesting and popular figure who feels like he can't be here and create his music safely.
Have we seen any more of that more broadly? Turkish artists fleeing for more freedom. There's been talk of this big brain drain. Many people have fled the country under Erdogan's era.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of other people who have, musicians specifically who have gone because they feel like they can't make their music. I
Right. There's
mean,
been some
of course,
journalists and writers. Sorry.
journalists and writers mostly, and of course, in Turkish history, we have many examples of this. There was the great political jazz and folk singer Tülay German, who in some ways kicked off the genre of Anatolian rock with her song Burçak Tarlası, who ended up moving to Paris and staying there. Zülfü Livaneli left for a long time. I think he was living in maybe in Norway and Scandinavia. So there are cases like that, but I can't think of any musicians at the moment, high-profile musicians who have felt like they've had to leave. But it could very well happen again.
Okay, Kenan Sharpe, thank you so much for your time and insights. It's been nice talking.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.